welcome to this semester's second Theorizing at Rowan event. My name is Edward Kazarian. I am a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and World Religions at Rowan University. And we are the host. Our department is the host of this event, which is also co-sponsored, and we're very grateful for this, by the Rowan Program in Women's and Gender Studies and the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And so I'd like to thank both of those distinguished institutions for sort of, their longstanding support of the series. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome Tamsin Kimoto, who's going to give us a talk entitled Thottery as a Way of Life. And I'll say a little bit more about Tamsin and the talk in a second. But first, I want to talk about the series. So many folks here have heard a version of this shtick before. But those who haven't or who are new to the series, Theorizing at Rowan is a work in progress lecture series that we've been doing for about 8 years now. And we have used the series for a number of different purposes. First of all, to encourage scholarly exchange among faculty and in our department and at the university broadly, but also to help us to sort of engage in conversation with folks from around the country and around the world. Generally, the focus of the series has been on theoretical humanities broadly construed, right? So roots in philosophy, but obviously also, we've had people from a number of other disciplines. And it's a work in progress series, which means that people are presenting their current research. And a big part of the purpose of the series, besides scholarly exchange, is to give Rowan students a chance to engage with people who are working academics, who are producing current sort of research, and engage in sort of discussion with them about sort of the production of new knowledge. So those of you who are Rowan students should feel especially welcome and encouraged to join in the Q&A that will happen after the talk. And that leads me to my second big point here. So how we're doing this on Zoom is we're having it as a Zoom meeting. I've sort of added a couple of restrictions just to streamline things. The chat function will basically only go to the hosts. So if you have a question or that you'd like to ask, or something that you'd like to add to the conversation, type it in the chat, send it to me, and I'll try to kind of keep a running list of who's who. And we'll, after Professor Komodo's talk, we will, move to a Q&A. And then we'll sort of run through that list basically. And people want to also use the hand raise function. That's another way of kind of getting attention. But honestly, things in the chat will be great. Can I mute the new entry notification? I do not actually know. Can I? I'm looking to see if I can.
Got it.
You got it? Okay, thank you. All right, so with all this said, let me just move to the introductions quickly, and then we'll actually do our presentation. So Tamsin Kimoto, who is here with us virtually from Atlanta, correct? Yes, is assistant professor of philosophy and women, gender, and sexuality studies at Goucher College in Baltimore. Their current research projects examine the racial underpinnings of medical narratives of trans identity and the links between environmental racism, racialized health disparities, and necropolitics in the United States. At Goucher, they teach courses on topics ranging from feminist and queer theory to prison abolition. And we are tremendously thrilled to have them here to talk to us tonight on the subject of Thottery as a way of life.
Thanks for the intro, Ed, and thanks everyone for being here. Ed said this was a work in progress series, and I took that very literally. I was working in progress until about 30 minutes ago. So the talk is not yet fully complete. So we'll see how that goes. And as I'm going to talk about it a bit in my introduction, exact contours and paths that the talk is going to go on has shifted a lot over the last week in response to the events here in Atlanta. And while my original intention was to talk about sluts, and I still think I am, and we can figure through more how we're doing that as we go along. But I look forward to Q&A and to talking more with all of you. And I don't know if it's possible, but could you turn on the closed captioning option? Do you have that? The live captioning?
I don't know if Rowan has sprung for that particular feature.
Okay. I will try to speak slowly then.
Excuse me 1 second. Tamsin, you may be able to do it from your end. I found that I had imposed it without knowing it and was trying to get rid of it from my end.
Oh, okay.
In a previous Zoom meeting.
So perhaps individually people might be able to turn on some kind of closed captioning. I will try to speak slowly and clearly, and I will put any long quotations in the chat so that you can read along with those. So let me go ahead and pull up my paper. I do not have a PowerPoint, so I will just be talking. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to position this so that I can read it and still see faces. Okay. So my original intention for this talk today was to have a bit of fun thinking through an idea I've been kicking around in casual conversations with people for years. The idea was essentially to push back on the sexual prudishness of much of contemporary feminism in ways that don't end up reproducing some of the creepier aspects of someone like Janet Halley's all-out assault on Title IX under the aegis of an ostensibly queer feminism. That is, I wanted to think through what it might look like to develop a feminism that celebrates sex through the lens of two of its most denigrated subjects, trans women and sex workers. Contemporary movements of trans and sex work exclusionary feminism are on the rise in the present, so it seems like a good a time as any to do this kind of work. I still intend to think through some of those elements here with all of you, but the events of last week have continued to weigh heavily on me. On Tuesday, March 16th, a white man attacked 3 different massage parlors staffed predominantly by Asian workers. By the end of that day, he'd murdered 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. While the police and media have been performing the sorts of mental and rhetorical acrobatics we've come to expect in the wake of white supremacist violence, it's obvious to anyone paying attention that he intended to target Asian women. Indeed, international news sources are reporting statements the man in question made to acquaintances that he intended to, quote, kill some Asians. Meanwhile, domestically, we are being told that this is a case of sexual addiction gone awry, and further, that his professed sexual addictions and interests in Asian women is evidence that he could not actually be a white supremacist. As an Asian person who has spent a great deal of time on dating apps, please allow me to assure anyone here who thinks this is plausible that wanting to fuck us is not mutually exclusive with wanting to kill us. Indeed, you might be surprised to find out how often the two go hand in hand. It's not unusual, after all, to find white supremacists with Asian partners, even as they refer to them as, among other things, quote, slant-eyed imports, end quote. Moreover, as I hope to show in what follows, the management of Asian women's sexuality is a key component of how anti-Asian racism functions in the US. Back to Tuesday. I heard what was happening in almost real time as it started to be shared across networks of community organizers here in Atlanta. As more details came out, it became clear that Asian women had been targeted. These attacks come in the midst of a huge uptick in violence targeting Asians across the United States. violence that many speculate is connected to the racist rhetoric of Kung Flu and the Chinese virus, and so met with an unusual interest in the goings-on of Asian America. Almost immediately, news sites and social media were filled with calls from prominent Asian Americans demanding for increased attention to anti-Asian racism, often in the form of increased policing and hate crime legislation. As much as the murders themselves, this is what occasions my shift in topic for today. Violence against women of color is often strategically used to advance the interest of a state that we know to be invested in a fundamentally white supremacist political order. In the wake of a massive movement against police violence, this call for further reinvestments in policing and other carceral strategies by Asian Americans and non-Asian feminists demands a response. So with the rest of my time here today, I propose to develop something like that response. Specifically, I want to demonstrate that an Asian American feminist history should link up the current moment on violence against Asian women more generally with the work of trans and sex worker feminists writing against the carceral strategies of mainstream feminism. Moreover, I argue that thinking from the standpoint of objectification, a standpoint I describe as a slutty one, should demonstrate to us the dangers of aligning our politics with the state. Instead, I turn to the work of Asian American and abolitionist feminists to articulate alternative feminist visions. I proceed in roughly 4 parts. In the first, I offer a reading of the Page Act of 1875. In the second, I give a brief account of carceral feminism, specifically attending to it as a form of social hygiene. In the third, I consider how this hygienic feminism links up with narratives of the model minority. And finally, I close with an account of how a slutty feminist analysis turns us to questions of unruliness and abolition. So, to begin at the beginning, let's go all the way back to 1875. Most popular histories of the Yellow Peril discourse that subtends anti-Asian racism tends to begin with the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in 1882, in order to frame how Asian Americans have been excluded from the body politic. Frank Wu's Yellow, for example, locates the Chinese Exclusion Act as the original piece of anti-Asian legislation that cemented Asian status as perpetual foreigners who are inassimilable to the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act is therefore the ground for anti-Asian and indeed anti-immigrant politics in the US, historically as well as in the contemporary moment. While it would be a mistake to overlook or downplay the significance of the Chinese Exclusion Act in the histories of Asians in the US, part of what I hope to demonstrate here is that this narrative covers over a labor, gender, and sexual history of exclusion embedded within the narratives of Asian America. Thus, in what follows, I elucidate a slightly different history of exclusion, or perhaps more accurately, a history that is embedded within the popular one that necessarily reframes the versions of Asian America we are used to encountering and prompts a more thoroughgoing feminist analysis of the present. So in order to do this, we need to go back to 1875, 7 years before the Chinese Exclusion Act would be passed. As part of a comprehensive review of immigration policy, Congress passes the Page Act of 1875. The Page Act has 2 key components. The first, a ban on immigration for the purposes of maintaining coolie labor. And the second, a ban on immigration for the purposes of sex work, which effectively became a blanket ban on immigration by women of East Asian descent. While both components of the act are important, I'll focus here primarily on the latter. Of the former, however, it is worth noting that the increase in workers of Chinese and other East Asian backgrounds had already prompted backlash among white workers in the US. The Anti-Coolie Act, for example, signed into law in 1862, had already imposed increased taxation on Chinese workers in order to appease angry whites. The Page Act, however, extended this in an attempt to restrict immigration by preventing people from transporting quote, to the United States any subject of China, Japan, or any Oriental country without their free and voluntary consent, end quote, in the kind of indentured servitude that characterized coolie labor. Violations of this aspect of the law would be subject to a $2,000 fine. I haven't done the math, but I think $2,000 is quite a bit of money in today's currency. Ming M. Zhu notes that a study of the newspapers at the time demonstrates that the Page Act was largely motivated by concerns over the impact that Chinese workers were having on the US labor market. On Zhu's account, the Page Act attempts to carefully navigate the tricky international relation problem produced by a treaty between the US and China, under which the US could not outright restrict immigration from China. While I don't doubt that the labor component is essential, the gendered aspects of the Page Act are worth closer scrutiny. Legal scholars tend to frame what the Page Act has to say about prostitution as characteristic of a moral panic over sex work. I don't doubt this, but I want to focus on how the Act and the rhetoric surrounding it also constructs Asian American women. Section 3 of the Act says the following, and this is quite long, so I will paste it into the chat. That the importation into the United States of women for the purposes of prostitution is hereby forbidden, and all contracts and agreements in relation thereto, made in advance or in pursuance of such illegal importation and purposes, are hereby declared void. And whoever shall knowingly and willfully import or cause any importation of women into the United States for the purposes of prostitution, or shall knowingly or willfully hold or attempt to hold any woman to such purposes in pursuance of such illegal importation and contract or agreement, shall be deemed guilty of a felony, and on conviction thereof shall be imprisoned not exceeding 5 years and pay a fine not exceeding $5,000. Asian women then enter into U.S. law as prostitutes and is therefore excluded from the possibility of even entering into the borders of this country. While this section of this text sounds like a broad-ranging policy affecting all immigration, it's being nested within the Page Act makes it clear that the only source of possible sex workers the U.S. was actually concerned about are those coming from East Asia. Ulysses S. Grant, in a speech to Congress later that year, makes it especially clear that Chinese women are themselves a threat to the social order. He says, quote, "While this is being done, I invite the attention of Congress to another, though perhaps no less an evil. The importation of Chinese women, but few of whom are brought to our shores to pursue honorable or useful occupations," end quote. Grant's words extend the Page Act to apply to all Chinese women. In truth, his insistence that few Chinese women were coming to the U.S. for any purpose other than prostitution was already common sentiment. Asian women were regularly denied entry into the U.S. by immigration officers because they were suspected of being sex workers. I want to highlight the word importation from Section 3 and turn our attention to Section 5, where it appears again. And here's another longish quote. That it shall be unlawful for aliens of the following classes to immigrate into the United States, namely, persons who are undergoing a sentence for conviction in their own country of felonious crimes other than political, or growing out of or the result of such political offenses, or whose sentence has been remitted on condition of their emigration, and women imported for the purposes of prostitution. While import literally just means to bring in, the modern connotations of the word imply objects and not persons. We rarely tend to talk about people being imported unless we intend to convey that they are being treated like objects. It's worth noted that import primarily appears in the text of the Page Act in connection with Asian women and prostitution. In the sections I've quoted here, for example, persons convicted of crimes in their country of origin are barred from immigrating to the U.S., whereas women are barred from being imported. The gendered reading here is obvious. Asian women are denied the language of agency under the law and are rendered as objects like Oriental rugs or porcelain. Asian women are therefore cast as fundamentally a sexual threat to the US social order precisely because of our status as pure objects. So that's some of the historical background for the present. Let's turn now to a consideration of carceral feminism. Mimi Kim notes that the term carceral feminism, and another Black quote, this is my last one. This is what happens when I write last minute. We end up with a lot of Black quotes. The term carceral feminism points to decades of feminist anti-violence collaboration with the carceral state, or that part of the government most associated with the institutions of police, prosecution, courts, and the system of jails, prisons, probation, and parole. Whereas the welfare state aims to provide benefits and the redistribution of resources, especially to the most vulnerable parts of the population, the carceral state focuses on activities of surveillance, arrest, and incarceration, often targeting the same sectors of the marginalized population who are recipients of welfare benefits. Carceral feminism reinvests feminist energy in strengthening the same kinds of state apparatuses that disproportionately impact women of color, while draining the same kinds of energy and resources from those parts that might offer whatever small improvements to those same lives. Carceral feminist strategies include a turn to an increased reliance on the rhetoric of sex trafficking, to name all sex work, a slight revision of the 19th century language of the white slave trade, collaboration with white right-wing or reactionary policymakers to pass even stricter regulations around consensual forms of sex work like pornography, and promotion of policing as a strategy for responding to phenomena like domestic violence and street sex work. Carceral feminists have been enormously successful in advancing these kinds of agendas in ways that might make the suspicious person wonder why the state exactly is aligning itself with feminists. What lurks behind the carceral feminist position is an intense investment in the notion of objectification and the notion that the object itself is under a state of constant threat. Catherine McKinnon, one of the primary thinkers of sexual objectification, writes that, quote, "To be sexually objectified means having a social meaning imposed on your being that defines you as to be sexually used," end quote. For McKinnon, the fact of the sexual objectification of women extends out beyond the strictly sexual and into the domain of women's social, political, and economic lives writ large. Indeed, objectification is so foundational to women's lives under patriarchy that it is internalized to the point that women are, quote, thingified in the head, and come to understand themselves through the language of the object. Sandra Bartkey adds further that this process of thingification works through various forms of external reminders that women are objects, such as catcalling, workplace harassment, familial reinforcement, and so on. McKinnon, along with Andrea Dworkin, and others from the radical feminist movement, joined forces on occasion with conservative lawmakers and activists to get ordinances passed that banned or restricted the sale of pornography. They were also influential in the passage of legislation around sexual harassment and discrimination. These kinds of collaborations are occasioned by the radical feminist investment in objectification and the state's investments in practices of social hygiene. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip over the part where I explain what social hygiene is, but by all means, let's talk about it in Q&A. We might note a couple of criticisms of this radical feminist claim about objectification as an ontological status. And we can think about this through some of the histories of Black feminist and socialist feminist analyses that demonstrate, for example, that things like the notion of domesticity of time past, right, were largely concerns for a white middle-class population. And I think so too, the status of pure objectification that McKinnon, Dworkin, and others rely upon tends to assume a fairly rigid and static notion of what it is to be woman. And we can talk about that more in Q&A. Sorry, I'm looking at time and I'm trying now to condense things.
You've got time, so.
Okay.
I'm just saying, you don't have to rush yet.
Sure. I'll still move a little quickly. I know sitting here for a long time listening to someone can be a bit of a drain, and I'd rather talk to you all anyway. So I want to talk about this notion that I mentioned in the introduction of hygienic feminism, and I want to talk about how this links up with narratives of the model minority. So to begin with, we should be suspicious of how social hygiene gets recast as a feminist project. Given feminism's histories of exclusion, one doesn't need to do a deep dive into the history of feminism to note all of the ways in which feminist politics and analyses have tended to circulate around the exclusion of a variety of people whom we might ordinarily think are women, which seems strange given that feminism's object is ostensibly woman. And this recasting of social hygiene as a feminist practice is part of a larger formation that I've referred to in some stuff that I've written called on hygienic feminism. So hygienic feminism turns on purifying and protecting the category woman from threats posed by kinds of women who do not fit a normalized picture of the properly feminist woman. Oh no, we lost Ed.
We'll soldier on.
So, for example, in an article that I've hope will be out someday, I've considered how TERFs are an example of a hygienic feminism, and I think we can say that carceral feminism is also a species of feminism, a species of hygienic feminism. In the current moment, for example, radical feminists have turned feminist energies against trans women and sex workers because these two groups of women challenge the coherence of the category of woman. Both are images of bad women. And in an effort to continually maintain and purify this category of women, trans-exclusionary radical feminists and sex work exclusionary radical feminists have relied on a number of rhetorical tricks. For example, the TERF, Holly Lawford Smith, in a series, in what she calls a radical feminist wish list that was posted to Medium, notes for her desire for a radical feminism that focuses only on women. Similarly, on Twitter, Kathleen Stock and others have denigrated intersectionality as not really a theory that is at all feminist because it's more concerned with not just gender. So we can think here about the picture of feminism that's predicated in such analyses, where attention to anything other than a bare notion of gender, any version of feminist analysis that, for example, cares about race or class, or we might even wonder whether or not sexuality, is in some way a failed feminist project. And we can think too about how this might work in terms of sex work exclusionary forms of feminism through the language of Shea Welch's existential eroticism, and in particular, her development of the term oppression perpetuating choice. Welch uses this phrase, oppression perpetuating choice, to examine the choices and agency of sex workers under conditions of capitalism and patriarchy. Welch's definition of sex work is notably expansive and includes many varieties of professions that we might not ordinarily think of as sex work, including things like waiting tables, for example, in restaurants like Hooters. It seems that any kind of job in which objectification is front and center counts as sex work. Sex workers have criticized this expansive notion, But we might also note the incoherence of the phrase oppression perpetuating choice. Indeed, if the radical feminist analysis is right, that objectification is central to the lives of women under patriarchy, and furthermore, that the elimination of objectification is impossible in the present and requires a radical reordering of society, then one might wonder what choice by any woman is not an oppression perpetuating choice, insofar as objectification in many ways characterizes how we move through the world, irrespective of our occupations and individual choices. It seems strange to call attention to sex workers as the exemplar of the oppression perpetuating choice. Indeed, this kind of rhetorical move serves to isolate sex workers from other women and to make of their labor a special category that denies, for example, that under conditions of capitalism, all of us sell our bodies. We can also think about how sex work has been erased from narratives coming after March 16th. And at the same time, our simultaneous investments in images of massage and sex trafficking. Eileen Lam of Butterfly, a Canadian organization that focuses on migrant workers and sex workers, says, quote, typically many workers in massage parlors are Asian, so they're able to use racist ideas about Asian women, they being the media, and activists and organizations, in their campaigns and messaging, that they, the Asian women, are too ignorant, they're too naive, and they cannot recognize their victims. Right? So this kind of rhetoric turns on the denial of any kind of agency to these women, reducing them once again to the status of pure object. And similarly, at a number of political rallies across the country, and especially here in Atlanta, all mention of sex work has been virtually omitted from much of the official response. And it seems impossible to think about how sex work is implicated in the histories of anti-Asian violence, despite the fact that it obviously is. Furthermore, this notion that sex work cannot be talked about is part of a purification strategy that has been essential to model minority politics for the last century, in which we have to create a notion of Asian America that is purified from concerns of gender, sexuality, class, that's silent, that's invisible, that's obedient, that does not make a fuss in order for processes of comparative racialization to work and position us as the so-called good minority. And these strategies of purifying Asian America have been advanced by Asian American organizations, which tend to center the interests of heterosexual Asian American men. So we can think here in that sort of classic women of color feminist analysis about how our gendered politics refuse race, how our racial politics refuse gender. So this is the last section. And here I want to think through why we have to insist on abolition, why we cannot turn to policing. And to begin with, I want to consider the story of Yang Song. So on November 25th, 2017, Yang Sung fell 4 stories from the window of the massage parlor where she worked in Queens. While she survived the fall initially, she died as a result of the injury she sustained from falling more than 30 feet. Details around her death were initially scarce, but it eventually emerged that she fell from the window after being chased by police through the building where she worked. It further became clear that in the months preceding her death, she'd been sexually assaulted by an undercover police officer and pressured to become an informant about suspected sex trafficking, details that she'd confided to her family in China. So increased policing, increased investments and interests by the police in these spaces of work did not protect Yang Sung, and they have failed so many others like her. In addition to increased policing, some have rallied around the idea of hate crime legislation and pushed aggressively for states to charge attackers with hate crimes. The problem with this, of course, though, is hate crime legislation, written as it must be under the aegis of colorblindness, rarely does what it claims to do. Instead, as many scholars have noted, it tends to be applied far more often to the very communities it was ostensibly developed to protect. Anti-lynching laws, for example, are overwhelmingly used to target Black communities in this country. So these kinds of solutions do not work. They're non-solutions. And they actually only serve to maintain the state's ability to use Asian Americans as something like a yellow barrier between itself and the Black and brown communities currently working for substantive shifts in how policing is conducted, or indeed for the outright abolition of policing altogether. And this fits with histories of Asian American racial formation in the United States. Claire Kim, for example, notes that Asian Americans are typically figured through what she refers to as racial triangulation, or what some others refer to as the middleman positioning between Black and white in US racial politics. This position is a fluid one in which Asian Americans slide between the two poles in ways that ultimately serve state interests. We're aligned with the state when it's convenient, and we're no longer aligned when it isn't. This kind of positioning frustrates many Asian Americans, but it's also impossible to deny that it is often warranted, and that we have often, as a group, fed into these kinds of model minority narratives in order to secure whatever kinds of small advantages they have allowed for the very few they do. So this talk was supposed to be about sluts. So what do sluts have to do with all of this? So in order to get to an answer to this question, I want to turn back to the very figure of the slut who occasioned my original plan for this talk. I was drawn to the slut because the politics and aesthetics of sluttiness, which ultimately is a kind of trashiness, suggests the refusal of the kind of logic of purity that undergirds the hygienic feminist projects, including things like carceral feminism, turfism, and swerfism. Sluts trouble this notion of purity by inhabiting a form of objectivity in a way that turns sexual objectification into something like an agential action, right? So sluts take on the position of being objectified rather than turning away from it. So in a sense, choosing to be objectified, leaning into it, to borrow the iconic feminist phrase from Sheryl Sandberg. And this is because sluts recognize that the subject-object relation on which the radical feminist position is premised is ultimately a false dichotomy. We can't actually think of anything like a pure objectification or a pure subjectification on the radical feminist account. And indeed, as we add class, race, trans, queer narratives to this picture, we get ever more complex notions of what agency and objectification look like. And I'm also interested in thinking through this figure of the slut as a metonym for the histories of Asian women in the US, because it reroutes our histories through the Page Act and calls for recognitions of how fundamentally excluded from the pure category of woman upon which hygienic feminism turns, as well as the pure Asian category upon which the model minority is premised. So rather than turning away from our positioning as sex workers under the Page Act, I'm interested instead in thinking through the kinds of complex sexual agencies that histories of Asian women have had to negotiate. Part of what I'm also thinking through here is my family's own histories, in which my great-great-great-grandmother was a picture bride to my great-great-grandfather and emigrated from Japan, having never met a man who was more than a decade older than her, effectively selling herself into marriage and therefore sex in order to come to, at the time, Hawaii. And this refiguring our history through the figure of the slut also puts us in direct alliance with other kinds of excluded women, such as trans women, sex workers, and indeed other women of color generally, right? And of course, Asian American women are also all of these other categories as well. And this allows us to not deny that. Furthermore, thinking with our slutty histories and the complexities of Asian racial formations in the US also grants an opportunity to rethink our positioning in the racial landscape as the middleman. Shireen Rashan Ravan reorients the notion of triangulation through the language of a racial third space, which she notes is, quote, an unrepresentable in-between space that eludes the politics of polarity as it confounds colonizing investments and boundaries that are used to produce and maintain notions of purity, racial, gender, and otherwise. This language of the racial third space gives us a way to reimagine what agency looks like as we work to articulate our politics in ways that do not feed into the same narratives used to oppress us, right? So under the theory of racial triangulation, our only opportunity for political gain is to articulate ourselves through a white lens, and thinking instead through this politics of the racial third space allows us to refuse that kind of logic and to instead rethink what our investments might be, framed through the language of coalition with other women of color and with other kinds of impure women. Affirming our slutty histories also allows us to recognize the fundamentally gendered, classed, and sexualized dimensions of this racial third space, and furthermore to recognize how all of these categories are fundamentally bound up with one another. So by way of conclusion, I want to meditate a bit on the notion of abolition. So as I understand it, abolition is a politics that aims to thoroughly rework and reimagine society such that a world without police, without prisons, without all forms of carceral logic becomes reality. Abolition is a utopian politics in the sense that Jose Esteban Munoz describes, in which utopia articulates a rupture of the present and the here in favor of a then and there, of futurity, of past, of otherwise, that's occasioned by our intense need, indeed our hope, for a world that can be reimagined, reworked, rethought, relived, and our disappointments, our failures as well. Trans women of color and sex workers, two of these categories of impure women who have been subject to feminist social hygiene, have developed enormous archives for articulating the possibilities and necessities of abolition. And I'll close a bit by describing one example of this here in Atlanta in the current moment. The Trans Housing Coalition is an organization and group of trans women of color who are dedicated to finding housing for trans women, right? And recognizing that housing, right, the lack of it is one of the things that puts us in closest proximity with police, that subjects us to all manner of violence, sexual, physical, verbal, legal, and posits housing as one alternative, right? One solution, one vision for what a just world might look like. So I'll stop there. And thank you all for listening.
Wonderful, marvelous. So I'm not Ed. Ed, this may shock you. Ed is having mild technical difficulties. And so I suppose I'm driving this plane now. I know. So that was marvelous. Oh good, and Ed's back just in time for the Q&A. But I did want to tell everyone while he's still getting himself together that we are going to have a Q&A, and you should start asking questions now, and we're getting some already, and this is great. So
yeah, I'm gonna actually, since Comcast has failed me here, folks, I'm sorry to say. So I might actually let Nathan and Whitney kind of take charge of this, because I don't know how stable my connection is going to be here. There seems to be some kind of actual outage underlying all this. So I will hang out, but if Whitney, you got questions, because I keep losing them, by all means start recognizing people, and you can, I've got it set so you probably need to unmute people to let them ask their questions. Cool.
Sure. I have a question in the chat. Should I just read that out? Or
yeah, you can read it, or if the person wants to read it, we can do that. Either way.
Okay, well, that's from Riley. If they want to unmute, I believe that people can unmute themselves.
I had set it so that they couldn't, but I can change that. Let's change that.
Okay.
All right. People want to unmute themselves, they can.
Riley would like to unmute themselves, and otherwise, I'll.
Hello. Yeah.
Marvelous.
Thanks, Tamsin, for your talk. So my question was, so I'm an Asian woman, and I've come to admire like performers that freely express their sensuality through art or performance. And perhaps I want to do the same, but I worry about doing more harm by reaffirming the sexy Asian stereotype, or having the wrong types of groups objectify me. And I just wanted to kind of gather your thoughts about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been thinking through this a lot, and I wonder in part about what it means to do more harm than good. Because in a certain way, looking at our histories, looking at our presence, I don't know that doing the opposite, right, of denying our sensuality, of hiding it away, of limiting it, of foreclosing it, has done any work of protecting us from these kinds of stereotypes, this kind of hypersexualization. So in a certain sense, I don't know what it would mean to do more harm than good on this kind of account, because it seems as though we encounter these kinds of stereotypes no matter how it is that we happen to be dressed or how it is that we happen to be expressing ourselves.
I realize it's quite a loaded question. It's quite, yeah.
No, sorry, I've been teaching all day, so I'm a little brain fried too. But yeah, I will say, right, that this may not be a strategy that works for everyone, right? I think it's something like what Munoz talks about in terms of disidentification, that this isn't really a kind of political strategy that's going to work for anyone and everyone. And in a certain sense, we can't know ahead of time whether or not it's going to do more harm than good. And I don't know, I'm at a point in my life, this is not a prescription for anyone. This is just me reporting my experience. I'm at a point in my life where I am fine. I'm comfortable with taking the risk. And in part, that could be because of my own access to social and cultural capital. Right? I'm a professor, so there's less risk in a certain sense for me in taking this on. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think my answer is I don't know what it would mean to do more harm than good. I think we're in a situation where there's only harm. So let's try a different approach.
Thanks for your honesty.
We've got another question in here from someone who'd like to remain anonymous, though I have to say it might be mildly appropriate that I'm the one saying it. What are some microaggressions associated with turfism and swerfism that are often overlooked? How can I, as a white woman, best try to avoid these?
Oh, I think usually the kinds of benign versions of the microaggression, right? Like my favorite one is I would never have guessed about being trans. That's a compliment, right? And it certainly is for some trans people, right? There are certainly trans people who enjoy getting those kinds of compliments, but the assumption that all trans people want is to look to be recognized as cis, I think is one of the ways in which, at least that I often encounter these kinds of microaggressions. There's also and I think this is something that both trans women and sex workers also encounter, right? The I'd still date you or I'd still fuck you kind of response upon coming out as one or the other. Right. In general, the subtle microaggressions are the ones that look like affirmations. The other ones are pretty hard.
I feel like a lot of like microaggressions for like anything is often like, wow, you're really blank for a blank, like anything like that, you know?
Yeah, you're really hot for a trans person is not the mood maker you think it is.
No, no.
Whitney, do you have more in the list, or do we want to sort of see? Oh, my internet connection is claiming to be unstable. Whitney, I'm kicking it back to you.
Well, I have one here. Not sure how to phrase this. Are there any aspects of feminist philosophy that are themselves instances of carceral feminisms?
I mean, I think most of the literature on sex work that's done by feminist philosophers is carceral feminism. Even when there's some attempt at restraint. Martha Nussbaum, for example, offers a different theory of objectification than McKinnon that I think still ends up reinforcing the state's power to regulate women's sexuality and the possibilities for intervention, even as she decries things like the criminalization of sex work. So I find most feminist philosophy done by people who call themselves feminist philosophers very unhelpful in thinking through alternatives to carcerality.
And that's all we have in the chat. If other people,
So maybe we could use the hand raise thing, or no, we got another chat.
We got another. Dr. Joe, do you want to ask your question, or shall I do it for you? I got it here. So I see Foucault behind Tamsin. Can they talk a little bit about how Foucault influenced them, and if they problematize any of his theory / work as it pertains to gender sexuality?
Yeah. So the account of social hygiene that I skipped over is one that I've developed from Foucault, and following in particular tracing a thread of his analysis of race and racism through his various college lectures at the Collège de France. So he's there in that way, in that he is the ground upon which, in some sense, I think through this question of social hygiene. And he obviously has very problematic things to say about, for example, sexual violence. But I have actually been thinking less through that aspect and more through his inability to actually talk about race and colonization in any of his work. This is something that Riley Snorton brings up in his book Black on Both Sides, and in like one paragraph managed to destroy my entire reading of Foucault. So that's actually the angle upon which I've been thinking more about it, what it might mean to articulate a theory of social, whether or not his theory of social hygiene, for example, has to be fundamentally reworked. Right, and in a certain sense, I also think Mbembe does some of this work too in his analysis of necropolitics. Yeah, my relationship with Foucault is not. I don't know if Facebook still has the "it's complicated" status, but that's where.
So just so everybody knows, I'm not seeing the chats that Whitney is getting, so you probably have to manage that piece of it. Are there any more?
Yep, got a couple. Do you think radical feminist rhetoric is a significant barrier to sex work policy change? Also, do you think decriminalization is the best policy for protecting sex workers in the US, or would you propose a different model?
Yeah. So I will say that I don't think radical feminism is all that radical for the most part. And to that extent, I do think it is a barrier. Right, because oftentimes radical feminist analyses turn again on protecting and purifying a category of women. And anyone who doesn't fit that category becomes I think a kind of failed political subject, right? Like I'm thinking here about all of our intense anxieties over whether or not Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin liked trans women, because contemporary TERFs like to use her work or use their work. And I've seen convincing arguments in both ways. And I sort of think, insofar as we're invested in maintaining this category of radical feminism, we're actually preventing ourselves from getting to a genuinely radical picture of what feminism might look like, right? Which would recognize that gender is fundamentally entangled with other aspects of social oppression, social identities. Right, intersectionality, for example, has a better claim to being a radical feminism than anything written by Catherine McKinnon or Andrea Dworkin or Kathleen Stock or any of the others who are using the term now. Decriminalization, the policy question. I'm not a policymaker. Decriminalization would be better than what we've got. Certainly, that's not working unless we're looking at something like the Nordic model of what sex work looks like. The best policy change, right, would be eliminating prisons altogether, right, and reinvesting in all of the kinds of things, right? If our concern is what gets called survival sex work, right, as the exemplar of what counts as sex work, then eliminate the need for it. If your concern is sex trafficking, and you actually mean sex trafficking, then substantively review immigration policies, right, and foreign policies, right? One of the key drivers of sex trafficking are wars throughout Asia. So I don't know that there's a singular policy shift I can recommend. I think abolitionists have done a lot of work demonstrating that it requires a fundamental rethinking of the whole social order.
All right. Is there any possibility from Phil, any possibility of an analysis of objectification that can explain why it might, in some context, be objectionable without contributing to carceral feminism?
I mean, probably, sure, yeah. I think there are certainly forms of objectification that I would find objectionable, right? Sorry, I'm thinking now what those forms are. I certainly think it's possible to talk about objectification in the interpersonal sense, right? Or even in a structural sense, right? Without getting us to this kind of ontological status that McKinnon and Dworkin rely on. To reference someone who came up earlier in the Q&A, Martha Nussbaum has a different theory of objectification, one that's about instrumentalization. And I think there's potentially something there that might be useful. As is often the case with Nussbaum, sometimes her descriptive work is more helpful than her prescriptive work.
Next question. This one's interesting. So it seems that a lot of people simply didn't know what a TERF was, and still kind of don't before J.K. Rowling. J.K. are being the probably her positions lately bringing the issue of TERFs to kind of to the surface of the cultural sludge pond. And in trying to bring up this issue in discourse with people who may even be unaware of trans issues in general, what do you feel is the best way to broach the subject?
Of TERFs?
TERFs and trans issues in general, but the question seems to be very TERF specific.
Okay. I'm trying to think how I introduce TERFs to my students. Usually they know about them. I'm trying to think of the last time I had to introduce someone to what a TERF was. I mean, I think that there is a lot right now that could be talked about. Right, J.K. Rowling obviously is the, I don't know, spokeswoman of the TERFs. I was going to call her the queen of the TERFs, but I don't actually think that's correct. But there's a lot that we could talk about in terms of domestic policy that's on the table right now. Right, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of anti-trans bills being debated in state legislatures throughout this country, right? I think beginning with those kinds of things, talking about the kinds of sentiments and animus that motivates them, right? For example, the belief in biological sex as a real thing and as foundational to what it means to be human, to what it means to be gendered. Is a useful starting point, right? Yeah, I guess it depends on how much time you got to talk about TERFs. If you've got a day or two and you're feeling really bored, you could go back and read The Transsexual Empire, and you also hate yourself. But I think beginning with policy is particularly interesting, right? Because one of the things that focusing on policy does is allow us to see how TERFs are very much interested in maintaining the state's power to police all women's bodies, right? Like the idea that what used to be a thing that I would giggle about, but that overt genital verification could soon be on the agenda, right? And that any kind of feminist, anyone claiming to call themselves a feminist, would push this, right? That's a great place to begin.
Would you call yourself a modern day feminist?
Sure. Yeah.
To bring Foucault back into it, speaking of Foucault and sexual and social hygiene, there's my brain slipping. Do you see any links between saneness / madness and your description of anti-objectification versus sluttiness?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think you could certainly do a disability analysis or a CRIP analysis of a lot of what I've said. I'm thinking I happen to have just taught some of this work in one of my classes. I'm thinking here of Alison Kafer and Robert McCrure on the links between compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory able-bodiedness, right? So thinking about the ways in which disability and sexuality mutually construct and reinforce one another, I think could be a huge thing, right? One of the things that both McCrure and Kafer talk about, for example, is our disgust with the idea that disabled people are sexual, right? And all of the kinds of social apparatuses that maintain, that reinforce, that legislate our disgust, right? All of the barriers to sexuality that we impose on disabled people. I think you could certainly lean into, I don't know why I like this phrase, uh, that as a way of thinking through what a
Take
criminal.
it back. Take back the leaning in.
It's just so useful.
It is. It's so descriptive, even if it's from such a sludge pile. I have a Andrew Diltz in the said in the having a comment and a question. If you'd like to say it now.
Is it okay for me to do it on the air? Or do I need to write it?
No, go right ahead.
On air, please.
Hi. So yeah, just thank you for that. I mean, so just a comment first, something that sort of occurred to me in the conversation about objectification. I was just, maybe it's because I'm teaching Beauvoir next week, but it's always just struck me as so odd too that it's not that difficult to go even just back to the 40s in the second sex and get a concept of, an ontological claim about the subject and the object. And she makes it as an ontological claim, but then locates what I think she calls it the absolute evil is the relegation of people purely to immanence as objects and not to acknowledge the reciprocal relation that all objects have as subjects as well. And so, I mean, just it's so much of like I've learned a lot of this from reading Tamsin as well, right? So much of the traps of so-called radical feminism bespeaks a complete inattention to the existentialist tradition. Like it's just sort of shocking, right? Where it's not that solves other problems, but so much of what I think we could read TERFs as, or some of that prefer farts, feminist appropriating reactionary transphobes, which I think might actually be, I can't claim that. I love that though. It's bad faith, right? And it's bad faith in just an incredibly straightforward Beauvoirian sense, right? That it actually genuinely refuses to engage with the ambiguity of being in the world, right? Like, and from people who claim both to be experts in and teach, in fact, some of this literature. It's just always baffling to me. So sorry, that's a comment, I guess, more than anything. And it's a comment that comes from also, I work in carceral studies as well. And so the utopian claim of abolition is always framed to as a pragmatic claim, right? And a reclamation of the language of pragmatism is a specific, like, this is actually what is really happening. And that carceral feminism, like liberal carcerality, is imaginary. It presumes to know that this time the policy solution is going to work. It's what I think we could rightly say it's an uncritical fabulation as opposed to Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulations, right? That, oh, we have the stats right this time. We have the single policy fix this time. Of course it's going to work. And I mean, that's just Foucault, right? Like prison reform is as old as the prison. Prison reform was never actually about fixing the prison. Prison reform was always about solidifying the prison as a form. So that's my question then is, why it's so important, I would just like to hear you say more, Tamsin, why it's so important to lean in also to this tradition in critical carceral studies as part of this, right? Because it strikes me that the contribution of this paper is at least two, if not like quadfold, right? And one of them is reminding us that in this moment, the anti-carceral feminist position is not merely a pragmatic response to the harms that are being visited upon sex workers, but it's also like an incredibly robust critical theoretical tradition of analysis. So I mean, really, it's a question of, can you say more about why in particular the abolitionist framework, and not just an abolitionist politics, if we could separate those, is helpful for thinking through the particular moment? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Say more about framework.
I'm using, I think, that as a shortcut to a way of analyzing concrete pragmatic problem. So in Iris Young's sense of the word pragmatic, right? Where Young says, by pragmatic, I mean this to be concrete political problems that we actually face. A framework for analyzing concrete problems that refuses to let us solve those problems with the state, or refuses at the level both of politics, but also like of an analysis, right? But because this is like the thing, if we're leaning into something, it's that there won't be something to lean against. And that seems important. Does that make, I think that's what that's where your thought is taking me. And damn it, I didn't mean to do a question. Is like, is that right? What I just said? But I'm going to do that.
Yeah, leaning into and not leaning against. Part of what this is bringing up for me is my favorite quotation from Audre Lorde, right, which is, "What woman here does not recognize her heel print upon another woman's face?" I think anti-carceral feminist position, and it's interesting to invoke Lorde in a conversation about sex work. We could have a whole conversation about Lorde's position on pornography, for example. I think anti-carceral feminist analysis, anti-carceral analyses are pragmatic in that Young sense of taking note of concrete political problems. I also think they're pragmatic in what we might think of as a kind of phenomenological sense, following Sarah Ahmed, in the sense that they require taking note of where it is that one actually is, right? And how it is that one actually is turned in the world, how it is that a world is actually turned to you, and all of the histories and spaces that make it such, right? What I appreciate most about the anti-carceral feminist position, right, a kind of abolitionist position, is the refusal to idealize where it is that we are, right? To recognize how incredibly fucked up and entangled and messy everything is, and to insist nevertheless that we have to keep going, right? And I think that is something that we need in the current moment, right? And I mean, the US broadly, and I also mean specifically Asians in the US. We're at another one of these historical flashpoints, I think, where we can choose to reaffirm our status as the model minority, or to make alternative spaces and alternative moves, right? And to make them more broadly. I see right now more energy than I've ever seen among Asian Americans to make this kind of move. But I worry about our conservative tendencies. So I think the anti-carceral analysis also contributes that, right? The pragmatism of the messiness, right? And also the pragmatic necessity of hope.
So I'm looking at the clock, and I missed a good chunk of what I think was a fabulous conversation. It sounds like I'm sorry that I missed it, but I'm also want to be respectful of everyone's time, Tamsin's and everyone else's. So if we're cool with this, I think that almost seems like a really excellent note to end on, and so I would like to first of all very personally thank my two co-hosts, Doctors Bauer and Cox, for saving my bacon here as I had technical difficulties and keeping things going. But I'd also like to thank everyone who came, Rowan folks, and also folks from around all over the place, some of whom I know, some of whom I don't, but I'm really pleased to see such a rich variety of people here. And I think this was a fabulous talk, and it seems like it was a fabulous Q&A, and I'm really grateful that we made this happen collectively, and I think we should all give Professor Kimoto a round of applause, and also all of ourselves. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you all.